Hi, everybody. This is the second panel of the afternoon of our workshop initiatives of anti-nuclear initiatives and movements in Brazil since the end of the Cold War. This panel actually will not be focused just in Brazil, but it will deal with nuclear and anti-nuclear movements and projects in Latin America. So I'm very happy to introduce the three participants of this panel, and I would like to thank them for their time. We have in this panel Arturo Sotomayor, who is Associate Professor of International Affairs and Director of the Security Policy Studies Program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. His areas of interest include civil-military relations in Latin America, UN peacekeeping participation by South American countries, Latin American comparative foreign policy and nuclear policy in Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico. And his research analyzed the impact of international socialization, militarization, and denuclearization in three areas: military operation other than war, transnational and border security, and regional non-proliferation strategies. And the unifying thread that runs through this research and writing is the interaction between studies on civil-military relations and international security, and research on the condition and requirements for domestic order and regional stability in Latin America. Then we have, as the second speaker, Raul Montenegro, who's an Argentine biologist, environmentalist, and activist. He formerly worked as a professor at the University of Cordoba in Argentina and at several other educational institutions. As an activist, as an environmental activist, in 1988 he received the Nuclear Free Future Award, and in 2004 the Right Livelihood Award, that is also known as an alternative Nobel Prize by the Swedish Parliament. And is a member also of the Argentine anti-nuclear movement. Last but not least, Chico Whitaker, who will be very soon with us online, is a Brazilian architect, a politician, and social activist. Chico served as an alderman for the Workers' Party in the Municipal Chamber of São Paulo from 1989 to 1993, when he acted as the majority leader for Mayor Luisa Erundina. And in 2001, Whitaker helped organizing the World Social Forum. And in 2006, he received as well the Right Livelihood Award, and is one of the members of the association called Articulação Antinuclear Brasileira, Brazilian Anti-Nuclear Articulation or Network. So we have this very rich panel, and I give the word now to Arturo Sotomayor. I know that he has some teaching commitments later, so I will give immediately the word to Arturo. Thank you very much for your time, Arturo.
No, thank you, Carlo, and desejo agradecer a você, a todos os seus professores da universidade, meus amigos brasileiros. Uma desculpa que eu não consigo falar português, faz muito tempo que não consigo falar, falo mais portunhol. Mesmo o espanhol, que é a minha língua materna, eu não consigo falar bem mais, porque eu já tenho muito tempo morando aqui nos Estados Unidos. Então, vou fazer a minha apresentação em inglês também muito ruim. Me desculpo por isso. But thank you so much for allowing me to present part of my research. So a bit of a caveat. I'm by training a political scientist, so I'm technically a social scientist, and I do mostly research on international security. And I'm venturing in this project I'm not a history of science, but I'm heavily relying on the history of science. And I'm not an art historian, but I'm using mostly art to falsify my hypotheses. So it's new territory for me. and I'm just going to share a few images of what I'm trying to do. Now, I'm not going to be concentrating exclusively on the anti-nuclear movement in Mexico. I actually want to talk a little about the origins of the nuclear project in Mexico. Carlo has a beautiful project, very similar to mine, but on Brazil, and I may be following his footsteps, and I'm using his book, actually, as a way of guiding my own project. So if we could show the next image, Carlo, it's called Research Puzzle by Accident. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came about with this project. So the first thing you should know is that I've been studying issues about the non-proliferation regime for many, many years. Almost 30 years ago, I was a research assistant to Juanita Cislo de Garcia Robles, who was the widow of Alfonso Garcia Robles, the recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. And so I like to think that I knew something about nuclear policy in Mexico. And in between 2020 and 2021, during the COVID pandemic, I was in Mexico trying to do some archival research. And to my surprise, one is the archives were closed. I couldn't do much archival research. Two, I wasn't able to do a lot of interviews either because, of course, the pandemic impeded that from happening. And the third thing is that any inquiries from me to the government were unresponded at the time. So here I was in Mexico visiting my mom mostly, and you can see me there wearing a mask, and completely desperate because I wasn't able to find any of the information that I needed. And suddenly I took pictures and I realized that I was surrounded by some of the evidence that I wanted to explore. I was at UNAM, at the National Library, and then behind me I saw an atom. I saw pictures of this sculpture called the nucleus, which was made out of atomic carbon in the 1990s, and it celebrates 60 years of nuclear research in Mexico. And I realized, oh my God, like maybe this is another way in which I can look for evidence, and hopefully I could trace down the process of what happened in Mexico and how Mexico became a nuclear energy developer in Latin America, but also a leading country in the non-proliferation regime. So the next image, thank you. So this is what the project is about. I found out, thanks to the art, right, and I'll show you some pieces of art, but I found out that Mexico's nuclear project began long before the Tlatelolco regime was negotiated. The Tlatelolco regime entered into force for Mexico in 1968. It was negotiated between 1962 and 1967. The treaty was put to signature in 1968. But in fact, Mexico's nuclear policy, including safeguards and also legislation regarding the use of nuclear energy, predates the Tlatelolco Treaty. And Mexico is one of the pioneers in developing nuclear energy in the developing world, along with Argentina and Brazil, but it's less widely known. So what I want to know is, why and how this project began. Why did it even occur? A rich and oil-rich country going into the nuclear energy venture. So these are some of the questions that I want to answer. When did the project begin? Why was it launched? Who were the main constituents and what facilitated or enabled the project? And this leads to the disarmament movement, and which is why did it fail? Because it failed. So the next image. So one of the interesting things if you ever get the chance to visit Mexico, Mexico is a very artistic country, and there's a movement, of course, called muralism, which is really public art. But one of the things that I didn't realize is the amount of art and public art that is on display in Mexico, treating specifically the issue of the atom and nuclear energy. So these are just some of the images that you can see in parks, in sculptures, in universities, in research institutes. And it includes, for instance, fountains like the one you see there. It's just across the street where I was raised in Mexico. It's called La Fuente de los Científicos Nucleares. And it also includes national libraries, the Faculty of Medicine, or what is known as the School of Medicine, and UNAM. It also includes research centers like ININ, the Nuclear Research Institute. There is art displayed all around Mexico, in museums, in galleries, in the streets, in public avenues, almost 113 pieces of art that I have been able to kind of typologize, right, and classify, revolving around this issue of the atom. And to me, this is kind of we can consider that a bit of evidence, right, and historical evidence. If we could see the next image. So part of the difficulty that I face, one is I'm not an art historian, as I said, and I'm not interested in exploring art for the aesthetics of the art. I'm not looking at it from the point of view of the artistic point of value. It has a value of its own, right? And I'm not going into this field because I want to know more about the artists themselves. Although, of course, these are some of the major artists that we had in Mexico, including Rivera and whatnot. And there's one important limitation here is that we have to be extremely careful on relying too much on art, because there's also something what is called subjective interpretation. It's not only what the artist wanted to portray, but what you, as someone who sees and visualizes art, are making, or you're trying to make meaning out of the art. That's not what I'm trying to do here. So I'll give you a classic example of some of the limitations that I face as I was trying to put together the pieces that I would use to essentially process straight Mexico's nuclear energy project. These are 3 images of 3 of my favorite artists in Mexico: Frida Kahlo, Remedios Varo, and Eleonora Carr. El Mundo Mágico de los Mayas. And of course, it has solar and nuclear energy as well in it. Now, these are beautiful pieces of art, but they are not necessarily in and of themselves an interpretation or a way of reflecting what was happening at that era. In fact, these are known as surrealist form of art. They're trying, of course, to explain the psychic, and anyone who's interested in political psychology should probably take a look at some of these artists. I'm really interested in artists that is highly correlated to policy and state policy. So if we can actually see the next image. So I'll tell you a little bit about what type of art I'm really interested in. In the case of Mexico, between 1936 and 1966, there was a convergence of politicians, intellectuals, scientists, and artists, and they all kind of converged in a common place called El Colegio Nacional. This generation of thinkers, scientists, philosophers, and artists, which included Alfonso Reyes, the Mexican ambassador to Brazil. It included Diego Rivera and Orozco. It also included nuclear physicists, the founders of nuclear science in Mexico. And actually, you can see one of them, Juan Manuel Sandoval Vallarta, who's in front of the picture to your right side wearing glasses. Now, the type of art that I'm specifically looking at is precisely the art that came from this group of intellectuals. And in the case of Mexico, muralism in particular is the one that best speaks about this type of phenomenon. It's art that was funded and sponsored by the state. Jose Vasconcelos was actually the first person who pioneered into this movement. And as Minister of Education in Mexico, he commissioned Orozco, Rivera, Siqueiros to paint about several issues revolving around the state. But in all of these paintings, you will see nuclear science components. So I'm looking at muralism and state-sponsored art. Now, the other thing that is known about Mexico when you look at art is that Mexico is also a place that developed what is now called arte nucleare. It's a movement that started in Italy as a result of Nagasaki and the Hiroshima nuclear bombs. And then over time, it expanded to other places, including Germany. 2 of the most important and influential countries where nuclear art was exhibited and also painted were Ukraine. What you see on the top is actually a mural that is painted in front of one of the nuclear reactors in Ukraine. Sadly enough, that site was destroyed by the Russians. It was also highly explored by surrealist art, including Dali's painting. But in Mexico, it flourished. So we can actually take a look at the next picture. And I'll be able to tell you a little more about the research design. I'm so sorry that there are no text. There is no text here, but I'll tell you a little bit about the research design and how that I came about with this research design. So first is I'm using sponsored art by the state that was sponsored funded, commissioned by the state. And I'm using that as what we call an analytical narrative, right? It's an analytical narrative, and it was probably commissioned by the state for a reason. So here's a classic example of Diego Rivera's Man at the Crossroads, which is exhibited at the Palace of Fine Arts in Mexico City, first commissioned by David Rockefeller in New York, but that project failed, and the Mexican government recommissioned it now specifically for one of its cultural sites. It represents humanity between war and peace at the crossroads of history, being shaped and influenced by enlightenment, especially science, technology, biology, but above all, being shaped by the spectrum of course, the atom. All right. And it was finished in 1934, and it was again commissioned by the Mexican government. The second thing that I also want you to understand is that these are also what we call massive state endeavors, and nuclear energy in particular, in the case of Mexico, is a massive nuclear endeavor. That shape not only the way we produce energy in Mexico, but also the way we produce science, but also other pieces of legislation in Mexico. The third component that you also have to take into account, and that's why I'm looking at art, is that this is not just the artist's interpretation, precisely because it was commissioned by the state. It has a very specific meaning. It was commissioned for a specific reason in a specific building. Many of these pieces of art are in fact in front of important institutional sites of nuclear energy in Mexico. Research centers like the National University of Mexico, like the ININ, the Nuclear Research Institute of Mexico, as well as other important sites, including the Palace of Fine Arts, which is what you see there, as well as the Presidential Palace. So they're fueled with state meaning. And finally, as you can clearly see from the mural there, they are extremely political. Muralism is a political movement, and of course they express political opinions. If we can see the next image, I'm going to show you a few of the images that I looked in and what they revealed to me. So the first thing I wanted to answer was why was the state interested in nuclear energy? That was intriguing to me. Again, I'm a political scientist, and I wanted to understand why the Mexican state, and in particular why the revolutionary Mexican state, was interested in nuclear energy. This painting is by David Alfaro Siqueiros. It's called The Bourgeoisie, painted in 1939, and it was commissioned by a syndicate, by a union, the Union of Electric Workers in Mexico. All right. And it portrays the conquest of actually nationalizing energy in Mexico after World War II. So a few things worth knowing about this. One is that the Mexican state, but very especially the Mexican revolutionary state, was interested in acquiring and monopolizing all sources of energy, including oil, which was done in 1936, and of course electricity, which was done in 1958. And acquiring monopoly over nuclear energy was the third component of the nuclear revolutionary ideals in many ways. And it really expresses the desire of the government and the revolutionary regime also to satisfy labor unions. So it's not just a scientific project, it's also a project by the state and for the state. Interestingly enough, the oil industry and the electric industry in Mexico have been liberalized, but not so nuclear energy. So nuclear energy continues to be under the monopoly of the state. Now, this is also very interesting. Think about how many other revolutionary states, and by revolution, I mean a profound, deep change in the political system that is brought up by either civil war or by, in this case, an insurgent revolution. But just think about all the other revolutions that happened in the 20th century, where indeed the state tried to acquire a monopoly over nuclear energy and eventually try to acquire nuclear weapons. Mexico is the first social revolution of the 20th century. It happens in 1910, almost a few years before the Russian Revolution, before the Chinese Revolution, before the Cuban Revolution. But think about all these other world revolutions where indeed the state tried to acquire not only nuclear energy, but also nuclear weapons. Right? It includes Russia, China. It, of course, includes Cuba, Iran, and many other revolutionary regimes. And Mexico is no exception. So thanks to this painting, I was able then to trace down what was the role state in developing nuclear energy. And what I found, for instance, that we could actually show the next page, is that once the project began, once the state decided that they were going to venture into nuclear energy, in 1959, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the state also transferred some decision-making to the military. And in 1959, the military requests the presidency to actually institute a Department of Nuclear Weapons and Chemical and Biological Weapons in 1959. And so what you see there are the two memos. The memo being sent by the military to the presidency of Mexico, asking for permission to create a Department of Nuclear Weapons. And then the second part is, of course, the transferring, right? The presidency saying, all right, I'm going to defer to the generals, right? The creation of the department. It's interesting because by 1959, Mexico had almost completed what we call the nuclear fuel cycle. In other words, the construction of the first research nuclear center was already underway, and it's going to be achieved in 1966. So by that time, Mexico had a lot of science, right? And now what we needed is, of course, the state regime support. Could we show the next image? So again, I'm interested in knowing, when did this happen? How did this happen? How back do we need to go? This, Carlo Patti in his book describes the influence of the diasporas and how scientific communities came to Brazil, but also how many other nuclear scientists from Brazil went overseas and got training. And the similar pattern happened in Mexico. And how did I find out about this? Of course, it's been studied through historians of science, but I am not a historian of science, so I had no idea that there has been this research project. But I went to a museum called Museum Dolores Olmedo, who's a former patron of Diego Rivera's art. And in that museum, you will see this painting painting from 1919. It's called The Mathematician. This is a painting that originally was painted in Paris, and is a very interesting painting by Rivera between muralism and then what's going to happen in the next phase, which is going to be cubism, because Rivera does play with cubism. What is interesting about this painting is that you can see the painting and then you can see the sketches. And this is considered a landmark painting because it's the first painting where Rivera explores dimension, a space, and does very specific mathematical calculations. And it portrays a very lethargic, reflective philosopher, mathematician, really, a physicist, reflecting on the future of nuclear science, right? Now, the myth in Mexico is that the artist was actually portraying Juan Manuel Sandoval Vallarta, the founding father of nuclear science in Mexico, someone who was trained at MIT, becomes a professor of nuclear science at MIT, wants to join the Manhattan Project during World War II, is unable to do it because of his Mexican origin, and in 1945 decides to return to Mexico and establish the first Department of Nuclear Energy in Mexico. And I found out that this painting is actually not Manuel Sandoval Vallarta, but it doesn't matter because Rivera and Manuel Sandoval Vallarta both created the myth that this painting was about nuclear science in Mexico. So if you go to the Dolores Olmedo Museum, you can see that. And what I'm trying to say is that many of these Mexican scientists really got their first training by actually leaving Mexico during the Mexican Revolution between 1910 and 1936. And many of them landed in Harvard, Princeton, and MIT, and that's how they got their nuclear science and nuclear know-how. The next slide. The other element that Mexico greatly benefited from is what we call the diaspora in Mexico. And just as much as scientists were being trained overseas, many scientists came to Mexico in the period in between wars. And in 1936, you can see I found a letter by Einstein. In 1936, Einstein writes to Generals Lázaro Cárdenas, then the president of Mexico, and tells him, I have all these wonderful scientists that I'm training here in Vienna, and I would like for you to welcome them in Mexico. They need a place and they're escaping the war. And something similar happens in Brazil. And by the way, something similar happens in Argentina, but with a different types of constituency. Now, how did I find out this? Because it turns out not only are there letters, like the letter of Einstein to Lázaro Cárdenas, not only is the Jewish community in Mexico very well organized that they kept records of who came, but of course, these scientists were painted. So you have Marcos Moshensky, who is painted on the left. There's another mural in UNAM called Ciencia, Arquitectura y Ciencia, which depicts actually the construction of the National University in Mexico. And then you can see also a mural that depicts the creation or the creation of, it's called the Department of Nuclear Medicine at the National Polytechnic. But very specifically, these artists like Marcos Moschinsky, Thomas Brody, who comes from Germany, and Dr. Blau is a woman. She's portrayed in that mural. These are all scientists that were actually trained in Vienna, or they came from Ukraine and Eastern Europe and were escaping. And they arrived in Mexico at a critical time, right when Manuel Sandoval Vallarta, Carlos Graf, and other Mexicans were returning to Mexico, and right on the eve after World War II. The next image. All right. So, again, we have diasporas coming in and out of Mexico. This is a phenomenon of transnationalism, all right? People coming in and out of Mexico, but in the end, returning to Mexico. The second key element in here that actually benefited enormously Mexico's nuclear project is Atoms for Peace. And in the 1950s, Mexico, through these scientists, right, that they had all these networks with Einstein, with Princeton, with Harvard, with MIT, are able to actually get funding from Atoms for Peace to transfer know-how and technology, particularly the Van de Graaff particle accelerator, which arrives in Mexico in the 1950s. And by 1964 is the beginning of the construction of the first research center and the first research reactor. How do we know these? Now, again, scientific historians like Carlo probably know that because you know where the archives are, but I have no clue. But I know that because there are two institutions in Mexico that narrate and tell us the story of these. One of them is the Facultad de Ciencias of UNAM, and you can see the mural is to my right side. It's called Man Conquering Energy, La Conquista de la Energía por el Hombre. And it narrates really the way in which Mexicans are able to conquer nuclear energy. That's exactly the purpose of that mural that was commissioned to Cesar Chavez, a former pupil of Diego Rivera, and it's at UNAM, and it's a UNESCO building, it's a UNESCO protected building. So I was able to do some research on this, and sure enough, the first nuclear lab ever opened in Mexico opens in 1958, and is in that building. The second interesting painting is by Eppens. This mural is not in public exhibit, but it is actually a mural that is painted at INIM, the research reactor in Mexico, which is in the outskirts of Mexico. And that's where the research reactor is located, the first one, because Mexico has 3 plus a nuclear plant was established. Now, interestingly enough, here again, what the artist was commissioned to paint was to say, this is where Mexico finally completed the nuclear fuel cycle. The painting that you see in the middle is a description of a woman. It's an indigenous woman that represents nuclear energy. The blue elements of that painting represent the fact that for the first time, Mexico is able to replicate the Cherenkov effect, which is an effect that can only be done once you're able to actually manipulate light and energy, which is what you do in a research reactor. And it was opened precisely along with the research reactor itself. So thanks to that painting, I was able to trace down when that happened, how that happened, and why it happened. Can we see the next image? Oh, well, unfortunately, you cannot see the entire chronology. I had a chronology there, but I don't think you can see it right now. I don't think it's visible. But I can now essentially establish what we call process tracing and get a bit of a chronology map of what happened between 1936 and 1966. So it includes, of course, a state and the institutionalization of the state in the form of the PRI. It then follows with the nuclear founders of nuclear science, Manuel Sandoval Vallarta and Nabor Carrillo Flores. It then is nurtured in the 1940s and 1950s by the arrival of immigrants. It then leads to the creation of nuclear science and experimental nuclear science in Mexico, specifically at UNAM and the National Polytechnic, leading eventually to the opening of the first research reactor in 1964, and Mexico completing the nuclear fuel cycle in 1966, becoming only the third country in Latin America to do so. Can we actually get to see the next image? So quickly, what are some of the lessons that I learned from this project? I was really impressed to see that Mexico was able to go from having no experimental nuclear research at all. It was all essentially what we call philosophy of science or theoretical research, but not experimental nuclear research. They were able to go from having nothing, no lab, to having 3 nuclear labs in less than 3 decades. And that was extremely fast. Very few developing countries are able to do this. The second thing that I was able to discover from these is that although, of course, the patronage of the state is important and fundamental. Without the state, there is no nuclear energy. It is really relevant to see the role of international actors. The networks that they had through Atoms for Peace, of course. The fact that the scientists themselves were highly politically active. Nabor Carrillo Flores becomes the rector of National University of Mexico. Juan Manuel Sandoval Vallarta becomes the Minister of Education in Mexico. So the scientists themselves are actually shaping education and policy. And the third thing, of course, is that you know that they were so relevant, right? The scientists were relevant during this era because even the greatest artists in Mexico, Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco, painted them. To me, it actually reveals that this is really an epistemic project, a project that is led by the scientific community for the purposes of science. And it's really not a military project, so we can begin to see that, in fact, the military is not extremely interested in acquiring a monopoly, and it's a scientific project overall. But it also shows that the scientists were highly politicized. They had connections within the political system. They become members of the political party, and they have connections with the military as well. Can we see the next image? And with that, I'm going to end my presentation. Of course, the question is, well, where do we go from here? Because the movement of muralism really kind of diminishes after 1966. And that's because of 2 reasons. The great muralists, Rivera, Siqueiros, and the others, they die. This doesn't mean, of course, that the muralists themselves disappeared, but Mexico enters a new phase of art, is modernism and whatnot. And the second thing is, of course, is this is after 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And there are going to be 2 other events that are going to greatly diminish the nuclear project in Mexico and eventually led to its collapse. One of them is the 1960 student riots that take place precisely at these university sites, which divide the scientific community and therefore led to almost this complete collapse. And that's why Mexico took so long to open a nuclear plant. Laguna Verde doesn't open until the 1990s, 30 years of delay. All right. And then, of course, the second aspect of that is that there are going to be strikes, especially strikes conducted by the nuclear workers. Those workers, labor unions that are working inside these nuclear sites, go on strikes. The most famous strike is a strike of 1976, where the strike against the liberalization of the nuclear energy project in Mexico, which impedes the privatization of nuclear energy in Mexico. And that almost kills the project itself. Now, ironically, this is art that the government never commissioned. There is no commissioned art for this. But I am telling you how I'm tracing this process now. I'm using images. And in this case, I'm using both photography and pamphlets to put together the next phase of the explanation, which is the collapse and demise of Mexico's nuclear project using photography. And you can see here the pamphlets. The pamphlets are a perfect example for me to trace process tracing, because we have a date to when the strike was called. We have a cause for why they strike. We have the powerful images there about nationalization, about keeping the nuclear industry within national hands. And of course, we have the photography that the state never wanted us to see because it never shows up in Mexican journals. It's not on memos. This is the art, or these are the images that the state didn't want us to see, but eventually leads to what we call the demise of nuclear energy in Mexico. But this is also the rise of the anti-nuclear movement in Mexico. So with that, I'll end my presentation. Thank you so much for allowing me to present some of the findings, and I look forward to your questions and to our conversation.
Arturo, for this fascinating presentation. I learned so much, and above all for this other approach you use also to nuclear history. So thank you so much, and also thank you so much for all the process, for understanding how the rise and the collapse of the Mexican nuclear history. Now I would like to pass the word to Raul Montenegro of the movement, anti-nuclear movement Republica Argentina, Movimiento antinuclear de la República Argentina, that will talk about the Argentine anti-nuclear movement. Thank you very much, Raul, for being with us today.
No, thanks to you. It's important to remember that the nuclear program of Argentina was initiated by a fraud. It was in 1948 when Ronald Richter, a scientist from Germany, proposed to President Perón to build a nuclear reactor, but not a fission, but a fusion reactor. Of course, this was a fraud. And after this fraudulent beginning, the Commission of the Atomic Energy Commission was created in 1950. But, it was a fraud. Thus, some scientists, I remember now the names, Antonio Balseiro, Mario Báncora, Manuel Benison, Pedro Bussolini, and Otto Gambe, they make a research and identified this fraud. And in 1952 was recreated the Atomic Energy Commission, but after a fraud. And this is an interesting beginning of the nuclear energy in Argentina. It is important to note that most of the nuclear program of Argentina was originally developed by military governments and afterwards supported by civilian governments. But the roots are military in Argentina. Currently, there are three main bodies linked with nuclear in Argentina. One is NEA, the same institution I mentioned, created in 1950. The second one is the National Regulatory Authority, this is NASA, supposedly independent for controlling nuclear energy. And number three is NASA, with the same name of the NASA of the state, but with a different meaning. This is Nuclearéctrica Argentina Corporation, mostly managed by the government. And these three bodies are the infrastructure, the nuclear infrastructure of Argentina. Now we have in Argentina a total of three nuclear power plants. The first one and the first created, it was the first nuclear power plant in Latin America, created in 1974, is Atucha 1. His roots is in Germany, from the Kraftwerk Union. The second one was Embalse, is a CANDU reactor from Canadian origin. It began to be in power in around, I have not now, it was in 1984. And the third nuclear power plant is Atucha 2. His functioning started in 2014. These are the three main nuclear power plants. And we have also another four under construction. It's a KM25. This particular plant is one of the small nuclear reactors, which are now the strong menaces for the nuclear development all over the world. And the KM25 was developed by INVAP, which is a company from Argentina. Remember that Argentina is an exporter. Argentina is exporting nuclear power plants to different sites in the world. Thus, we have these three nuclear power plants, and we have a total of 5 nuclear research reactors. Of these 5, one of them is very near my house. It's in the National University of Cordoba. But Argentina also was responsible, as I told before, for the building of nuclear power plants outside the country. And we have a small list. In Peru, Argentina built two nuclear research reactors. In Egypt, the ATTR-2 also was built by Argentina. In Algeria, we have the Noor reactor, also from Argentinian origin. And recently was the Opal. The Opal is a replacement reactor that worked in Sydney, in Australia. And this reactor was built by INVAP. After a long fight of Argentinian NGOs jointly working with Australian people that fought against this replacement reactor. We're talking of some nuclear reactor, and we need to add one more to be built in the Netherlands. Also, a nuclear research reactor built by Argentina. It's important to mention that Argentina was the first country having a nuclear power plant, but also Argentina was the first country having the worst nuclear accident in the region. It happened in 1983 in the RA2 reactor. We are the first nuclear accident, the first victim with one person killed during the accident. And this was also the first group of people affected by radiation, particularly gamma rays and neutrons. And this was during this accident. This was a number 4 scale event. You remember that all the nuclear accidents and events are summarized in a scale that arrive from 0 to number 7, like it happened in Chernobyl or Fukushima. But Argentina has a number 4 with one victim, and also 17 people affected by radiation. Also important to mention is that Argentina has very strong past vis-a-vis mining, uranium mining. In fact, we have a total of 3, 4, 5, 6, is in total 6 uranium minings. Of this total of uranium minings, all of them are closed for different reasons. In a definitive way, we have 3 of these uranium minings in Mendoza province. One of them, Sierra Pintada, the government tried to restart their work, but a lot of organizations, NGOs, popular movements in San Rafael, and even private companies worked jointly to stop them, and we were successful to stopping the restart of the uranium mining. We have all our uranium mining are closed, absolutely closed, but without remediation, and this is very important issue. We have closed uranium mining, but they continue to pollute the environment because they will never remediate it. And one of the cases in Los Gigantes is in Córdoba province, is my province where my university is located. Los Gigantes was closed in 1989 after beginning in 1982. And we are responsible for the closing of this mining, uranium mining, after several years of fights and several years of bad activities of the uranium mining of Los Gigantes. This is more or less the general structure of our nuclear program. It is important to mention that in Argentina, the nuclear program includes a lot of facilities for producing heavy water, for producing, for enriching uranium, for producing the fuel for nuclear power plants. We produce natural uranium, is 0.85% of 235 uranium, but we also produce LEU, which is the slowly enriched uranium fuel. But Argentina has also a lot of different structures linked with this complex system of our nuclear program. It is to take note and to take in account that Argentina has not solely all the system of the nuclear field perfectly ensembled, perfectly structured, but Argentina has become an exporter of nuclear power plant, but also of nuclear technology. Due to this fact of development of the nuclear power plant and also the development of the relationships between the nuclear power system and the citizens, it is important to mention that Argentina, like Brazil, during the period of military power, tried to build nuclear bombs. This is very important to take in account. In Argentina, during the military power, they tried not solely to produce the nuclear bomb after developing a plant for the recovery of plutonium-239 from exhausted nuclear fuel, but also Argentina devoted efforts to build 2 rockets for the transport of nuclear devices. This was during the military period, and when the democracy restarted after this long period of dictatorships, we're talking of 1983, all these projects of building the nuclear bomb in Argentina, but also, and previously, the project of these 2 rockets for the transport of nuclear devices were stopped. Even from our organization, FUNAM, we stopped it at the time, and this is very interesting. It was a project of a legislator. He proposed a very strange law. It was a law that permitted the use of nuclear weapons for engineering. Like some kind of structure that could be named like nuclear bombs for peace. But fortunately, we started this campaign against this project of law, and finally, this project of law was filed. But it's important not to forget that Argentina and Brazil started a career for having nuclear weapons. Of course, Tlatelolco stopped this, but we need to take this in account because this put in front of us the strategy of the apple cake. What means the apple cake strategy? You don't need to have a nuclear bomb because you have plutonium-239 in one place. You have technical availability of instruments, of different kind of structures for producing the bomb. Thus, even if we are under Tlatelolco, countries like Argentina, if they decide to build a bomb, they can build a bomb. And this is the same case for Brazil. This is the apple cake strategy. We have the powder, we have the apples, and we have the kitchen, but we don't have the bomb. But we have the possibility. Don't forget that in Israel, that has between 90 and 200 nuclear weapons, they built all this nuclear arsenal from the Dimona nuclear research reactor. Thus, with this structure, when the movement against nuclear started, in fact, this is very interesting. By the first movement started against uranium mining, and later against nuclear reactors. Which was the beginning? The first demonstration against nuclear and against the possibility of the building of a nuclear power plant in Cordoba was held here in Cordoba. This was in 1986 or 1987. It was more than near 2,000 people protesting in streets of Cordoba against the possibility of a second nuclear power plant in Cordoba. A second plant to be built near the Candu reactor, the Candu 6. We have 80 kilometers from the city. And this was the first movement. But another historical movement was the movement in Patagonia. In Patagonia, and we cannot forget to mention Rodriguez Pardo. He was one of the leaders linked with this citizens movement that stopped several years after this first demonstration. They stopped a very important project for the spirit of the nuclear atomic plant in Argentina. At the time was the project for the building of the first repository for high-level radioactive and exhausted nuclear fuel for being deposited in Gastre. This was in an area of Patagonia, in a very plenty of mountains area, and this was the project to put all this exhausted nuclear fuel 500 meters in depth, and this was absolutely stopped by a giant demonstration, thousands of people in the streets of Teleu, and they stopped the project of this repository. And after this, a lot of different small struggles began against uranium mining, in general linked with fights against mega mining, but also against the nuclear power plants Atucha 1, Atucha 2, and Embalse. And finally, in 2018, that means 5-6 years ago, was created the MARA, which is the anti-nuclear movement of the Argentine Republic. And this is a linkage of assemblies fighting against nuclear. But it is important to mention that in Argentina, the fighting, the resistance against nuclear is distributed. We have a lot of NGOs that work since a lot of years, like ours, founded in 1982. We have FARN, even Greenpeace in Argentina produced a lot of very interesting fight. That's we have like a menu of different fighters. We have the MARA, which is the big movement. We have the NGOs, but also we have people working in the universities that are fighting against nuclear power. And I think that this is a very original thing, is that this is not only one sector fighting, but this is a list of different social actors fighting against nuclear. And one of the most recent success in these fights happened in the province of Rio Negro. You know that one of the strategies of the recent governments, the previous government before Alberto Fernandez, the government of Mauricio Macri, they tried to create conditions for the building of a nuclear power plant in Rio Negro, a one-on-one Chinese reactor. They tried, but the movement in Patagonia is very strong in Argentina. I was in this big concentration of people in the streets of the capital of Rio Negro, fighting against this project. And finally, we have success. And finally, the people of Rio Negro, all the organization working against the one-on-one reactor, which is a very experimental reactor, even being a nuclear power reactor. And the reactor, these projects was filed for, because even more than a decision as a result of this movement, the government of Rio Negro approved a law that forbids the building of nuclear power plants produced with technology from outside. And it was very, very important. And now we are fighting because the government of Alberto Fernandez is trying to build also this reactor, but with a 100% of financing from China. Thus, we are fighting strongly against this. But at the same time, happening, and of course, Chico will talk also about this, because now, and since I think some months, we are trying to work together, the anti-nuclear movement of Argentina, jointly with the anti-nuclear movement of Brazil, because unfortunately, the president of Brazil, Lula Inácio da Silva, and the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez, agreed on pushing, on giving a new energy to the nuclear power plants in Brazil and Argentina, and through two nuclear reactors. One is the multifunction reactor in Brazil and the RA-10 nuclear reactor in Argentina. This is the core issue of this agreement. Thus, we are fighting against, when we are saying we are fighting, is all these different social actors, because one of the main characteristics of the nuclear program in Argentina, and I think it was the same in Brazil and the same in Mexico. Now we're trying to contact this excellent, strong group of women that since 1987 are fighting against the nuclear in Jalapa in Mexico. I said that one of the characteristics of the nuclear power is that they don't respect the legislation on environmental impact assessment and public hearings. They take decisions, even in democracy, but like in dictatorships, without consultation. And this is why with Juan Smith and also with Fabian Maggi, two excellent lawyers, we started penal procedures against the government because they signed it without environmental impact assessment, but without also public consultation. They signed a commercial agreement with China for the building of the 1-on-1 nuclear reactor in Argentina. This is really a very small summary, very, very small, because the reality is much more complex, because Argentina has also production of nuclear fuels for different kinds of reactors. And Argentina has also a strong structure for the export of different kinds of nuclear components to other countries. And this is, for me, this is very dangerous. We are not only a country nuclear, but we are also expanding nuclear in different countries of the world. Finally, it's important to mention two important things. You know that when you are facing a nuclear accident or event like Fukushima or like Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island, it's very important to have your population prepared for the worst accident or event. Unfortunately, I think it's not by chance. We don't have our population prepared for the worst accident or event. But not only this. We don't have hospitals or health system prepared for the worst accident or event. In the case of the worst event or accident in Atucha 1, the area covered by eventual radioactive clouds is 500 to 700 kilometers. But we have no preparation for this. FUNAM, several years ago, produced citizens' manuals for facing nuclear accidents. Why? Because the governments, they never produced this kind of instrument for preparing the population and for preparing the health system. That's the next step, and I think we are trying to work this. It's not only to join Brazil, to join Mexico with Laguna Verde, but also to join all countries having nuclear research reactors. Chile has 2 nuclear research reactors, for doing a strong movement, for having the same weight of this technological lobby, sometimes with nationalistic profiles, to have the same power in the side of citizens, in the side of organizations, in the side of assemblies, for fighting against this strong lobby. And this is very interesting. Meanwhile, Germany is close all their nuclear power plants in Latin America. Ignacio Lula da Silva on one side, Alberto Fernandez in the other side, are refloating nuclear. This is very strange. Our first nuclear reactor was from Kraftwerk Union, from Germany, our first. And now Germany, the source of our first nuclear power plant, is closing all their plants. And here, our leaders, without consultation, and with this, we agreed with the Articulação Brasileira, that it's impossible to continue in the same way of the dictatorship. We need environmental impact assessment, information for the public, public consultation. No more dictatorship, but also no more nuclear dictatorship in democracy, which is as dangerous as the other one. That is the summary. I am very happy. Maybe, I don't know, Carlos, but your webinar is historical. This is the first time in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, that was included in the program the free movements of the free realities, nuclear realities, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil. Thus we are in a historical moment. I am very, very happy. That's a big hug for everybody. And as one of the leaders of the Italian government, Sandro Pertini, told, we need to fight, not only without fear, but also without hope. Everybody can fight. When you will be the winner, but not every time. People fight when you don't have possibility of being the winner. Thus, I repeat this statement of Sandro Pertini. We need to fight, not only without fear, because our region is very dangerous, but also we need to fight without hope. Gracias.
Gracias. And I give now the word to Chico Whitaker. We heard this morning about several movements here in Brazil. We have the people from the Association of the Victims of the Goiânia accident. We had also Professor Alencar talking about the mining associations, above all in Caetité. And then we have Monique Chessa, who talked about Angra. But it would be great also hearing from you, Chico, about the anti-nuclear movement here in Brazil, since you are one of the organizers of this network. The word is to you, Chico. Thank you very much for joining us.
Você vai me desculpar se eu falar em português?
Acho que está ótimo. Eu vou fazer uma tradução caso precise, mas não tem problema nenhum.
E o meu inglês é péssimo.
Então, pode ir para frente.
Entendo mais ou menos, mas tenho muita dificuldade em me expressar totalmente em inglês. Então, eu começaria, boa tarde para vocês, muito prazer em participar disto, como diz o Raul, é uma grande iniciativa essa de criar esse tipo de espaço para a gente discutir mais. Mas eu queria dizer, de início, me apresentar. Quer dizer, eu sou um novato nessa área. Eu estou, digamos, há 11 anos. Isso. Inclusive, isso explica um pouco também por que os movimentos antinucleares brasileiros existem organizadamente agora. A nossa história, como em todos os nossos países, começou, nossa história nuclear, começou logo depois da guerra, logo depois das bombas. E foram os militares que se interessaram naquela corrida armamentista que se começou logo depois de Hiroshima e Nagasaki. Porque era chamado, o poder nuclear era, digamos, a grande meta dos militares brasileiros e que rapidamente se articularam para começar a introduzir no Brasil essa tecnologia e a possibilidade do Brasil fabricar sua bomba. E aí tem que dizer que realmente era uma competição com a Argentina. Quer dizer, os brasileiros viam naquele momento, os brasileiros, aí já começa a fazer distinções. Não é? Os setores, digamos, de governo viam, e alguns setores intelectuais, etc., o risco da Argentina ter uma bomba antes dos brasileiros, os militares. Então era preciso que o Brasil entrasse por esse caminho. E a história, mesmo a nossa usina nuclear que nós temos em Angra, está num complexo cujo nome, o nome do complexo é o nome do almirante, que se lançou mais bravamente nessa busca de tecnologia e de possibilidades de ter bomba brasileira. Foi por aí que o Brasil começou. E as usinas entraram, a produção de eletricidade e os outros tipos de uso da energia nuclear, ela entrou também através de um artifício que foi criado para continuar a desenvolver a tecnologia, que foi exatamente os famosos átomos para a paz, o famoso programa do Eisenhower, que lançou a ideia de fazer usinas nucleares, porque com isso, obviamente, de um lado se continuava a desenvolver a tecnologia, e de outro lado também já se produzia como subproduto um pouco do combustível necessário para a bomba, que depois já tinha sido testado em Nagasaki, que era o melhor, era o plutônio, e era exatamente, esse é um subproduto natural quase das usinas nucleares. Então, dentro desse bolo geral, é que no Brasil começou a movimentação. A movimentação que começou, portanto, foi pró-nuclear, dos militares e daqueles setores que tinham digamos, uma noção equivocada de geopolítica, no sentido de que é importante o país ser poderoso, não somente para se defender de eventuais ataques argentinos pelo sul, mas também para impor sua vontade pela posse da bomba. E isso até recentemente, em que o Brasil fica sonhando em entrar, ser um dos membros do Conselho de Segurança da ONU, porque é o conselho dos que tinham a bomba. Depois outros países conseguiram, mas o Brasil quer ter a bomba para poder, inclusive, entrar no Conselho de Segurança da ONU. Então, tudo isso está digamos, na imaginação militar e na imaginação política de setores políticos que pensam que é preciso ter poder no mundo para conseguir vantagens. Bem, isso eu digo para dizer o quê? Tudo começou nisso. E as iniciativas que foram tomadas quando se decidiu, então, começar a construir usinas, foram pontuais. Quer dizer, o pessoal que lá na SAPE reagiu contra a usina de Angra, antes deles houve um grupo também, um movimento que se criou, que numa outra região do estado de São Paulo, também tinha sido cogitado de construir uma usina na região sudeste do estado, a região da Jureia. Lá também eclodiu um movimento popular, digamos, de reação aquela usina e que foi vitorioso, inclusive, que não conseguiram construir na Jureia. Mas aí ela ficou pontual, incidiu em seguida sobre a questão da mineração. Então se criaram movimentos na Bahia, agora está criado um movimento bom, grande no Ceará, que tem uma ideia de se criar, de abrir a mina de urânio lá na região lá no Ceará, e também situações muito específicas que se criaram, mostrando o risco dessa tecnologia, especialmente através do acidente de Goiânia, que foi um acidente muito impressionante. Mas tudo isso não mobilizou as pessoas no Brasil. Inclusive, a própria questão da bomba era uma coisa muito longínqua. Se isso está muito próximo, digamos, da experiência dos europeus ou dos norte-americanos, na verdade, e dos asiáticos, dos japoneses, com Hiroshima e Nagasaki, aqui para o sul aqui do mundo, era uma coisa assim meio, digamos, vamos pensar nisso, mas não tem assim esse risco tão grande, mas depois já naturaliza. Já se consegue viver apesar dele. Inclusive, o acidente de Goiânia teve muito mais vítimas do que aquelas que são declaradas, obviamente, porque isso continua até hoje. Quer dizer, até hoje se descobrem situações que são decorrentes do acidente de Goiânia. Outro dia mesmo, há pouco tempo atrás, um amigo meu estava no hospital referência de câncer no interior do estado de São Paulo e sentado ali na sala de espera, com outra pessoa que estava com parentes ali dentro sendo tratado. E quem era essa pessoa? Era uma pessoa que tinha vindo de Goiânia. Ou seja, 30 anos depois, tem gente ainda aparecendo câncer, morrendo de câncer. Ou seja, isso ninguém está sabendo, ninguém está contando, ninguém está sistematizando para saber exatamente a dimensão. E foi um acidente puramente radiológico, de um aparelho de uso medicinal da radiação, que ficou abandonado e dali ele passou a ser, espalhou-se pela cidade, porque quem manipulava aquilo não tinha a mínima ideia do risco que estava manipulando, e os próprios o pessoal do governo que foi para lá foi atrasado. Descobriram por acaso. Em Goiânia, descobriram por acaso. A chamada cápsula do aparelho de radioterapia que tinha lá ficou uma semana ali, né, e foi levada num saco de supermercado para o centro de saúde, deixada numa cadeira lá. Enquanto isso, ele estava irradiando, contaminando bastante gente. E, de repente, um físico, um estudante de física quase, que ficou sabendo daquilo, foi verificar, mas isso é uma loucura. Isso aqui, essa cápsula aqui vai matar um monte de gente. Então, já aí que nessa altura é que acordou a Comissão Nacional de Energia Nuclear, mandou gente, mandou 2 dias depois, ou seja, uma inconsciência absoluta do risco que estava correndo. Tudo isso foi, digamos, os prolegômenos dos nossos movimentos. Pontuais, situações específicas, sustos, mas nada assim de muito profundo. Realmente, a nossa tentativa de articulação começou com Fukushima, nem Chernobyl. Chernobyl também era uma coisa muito longínqua. Podia ter notícias, as coisas, etc., mas era lá longe. Fukushima, não sei porquê, e eu acho que não é a colônia japonesa no Brasil que puxou isso, não, mas a Fukushima teve o dom de acordar muita gente pelo mundo. E ela acordou, principalmente a Alemanha, que por causa disso resolveu eliminar aquele risco do país deles. Então, no fundo, o que aconteceu, que nos levou no Brasil a passar a querer trabalhar de maneira mais organizada, quer dizer, além do o nosso amigo Goldenberg, que o Carlos já falou aí de manhã, que, aliás, só para informação, ele é só um pouquinho mais velho do que eu. Quer dizer, no fundo, eu estou na faixa de idade dele. O Goldenberg eram pessoas assim, isoladas quase, quando a gente indica no dedo este em tal universidade, este em tal universidade, este, como o Joaquim Francisco, que foi diretor da Indústria Nacionais Brasileiras e pediu demissão aí para Santos, porque percebeu, são pessoas que de repente se dão conta daquilo que elas estão fazendo, estão trabalhando numa coisa que é uma insanidade, digamos. E aí, então, esse susto que, no fundo, fez nascer no Brasil os nossos movimentos atualmente organizados. Eu sou dessa fase. Em 2011, amigos vieram me chamar, dizer, olha o que aconteceu na Fukushima, será que as nossas duas usinas aqui não pode acontecer uma coisa igual aqui? Vamos tentar agir. Aí é interessante uma coisa que eu vou dizer para vocês, né, todos vocês sabem, no Rio de Janeiro, uma porção de pessoas começaram a se articular em torno, principalmente, da ajuda que estava dando o Instituto do Partido Verde. Ele que estava animando esse pessoal a fazer. E, ao mesmo tempo, em São Paulo, outro grupo mais ligado à Universidade de São Paulo, inclusive a um professor que tinha participado das lutas de Jureia nos anos 80, ele voltou e falou, olha, gente, é por aí, temos que dar um jeito de participar. E o mais interessante que aconteceu, que foram criados nesse momento duas organizações. Uma nacional, que já nasceu, inclusive, apoiada nos movimentos ambientalistas que já existiam no Brasil, chamada Articulação Antinuclear Brasileira. E ela já nasceu para, digamos, articulação, as pessoas que estavam pontualmente reagindo contra o nuclear em diferentes lugares. E em São Paulo se criou uma outra organização, Coalizão por um Brasil Livre de Usinas Nucleares, com base mais na USP, na Universidade de São Paulo, a partir desses professores que tocaram essa mobilização. Então, a partir daí, eu pessoalmente comecei a tentar entender um pouquinho. Aliás, eu tive muitos professores, entre os quais o Raul. O Raul foi um professor para mim. Aí, pelas tantas, ele me premiou com um convite aí até Córdoba, durante o qual ele me fez visitar a usina de lá e todas as questões que existiam. E ele, como vários outros, como um amigo comum que nós temos, eu e ele, que é o Laponche, lá na França, o Bernard Laponche, eram pessoas que eu perguntava, o que é isso? Como é que é? Inclusive, agora, muito recentemente, nós tivemos a infelicidade de perder por doença um dos técnicos da Comissão Nacional de Energia Nuclear, dos caras mais sérios que tinha lá e mais competentes, que foi inclusive, quem denunciou a loucura que ainda quer se fazer no Brasil, mas ele denunciou nos anos 80, não, 90 e pouco, ele denunciou a usina de Angra 3 pelo caráter obsoleto do projeto com o qual ela estava sendo construída. Quer dizer, foi um projeto elaborado antes de Three Mile Island e que, portanto, não tinha nada, e que não tinha sido atualizado. Então, ele denunciou, nessa altura ele teve um apoio, teve a possibilidade de apoiar o Ministério Público. Agora, é dessas coisas que a gente vê quem a gente está enfrentando, né? O Ministério Público, um procurador corajoso, assumiu essa briga e começou também a brigar, depois da denúncia feita pelo Sidney, pelos jornais, inclusive, que não foi uma coisa assim pequena, foi uma coisa grande. O grande jornal do Brasil publicou um artigo dele, a Eletronuclear reagiu, respondeu, ele deu uma tréplica e quase foi expulso, só não foi expulso porque da Eletronuclear, porque a Associação dos Fiscais o protegeu, e ele então continuou lá. Mas o Sidney ajudou muito esse procurador, que fez uma ação para parar enquanto não fizesse uma atualização. Pelo menos se quisessem continuar a construir, fizessem pelo menos uma atualização do projeto, a partir do que se tinha aprendido com o acidente de Three Mile Island. Que o projeto era o acidente foi em 79, o projeto era de 76, quer dizer, não dava para não fazer. Bem, esse promotor foi misteriosamente, não, surpreendentemente, retirado daquele lugar para Foz do Iguaçu. Para quê? Para, obviamente, não continuar a amolar muito o pessoal de Angra. Bem, isso para dizer que eu, pessoalmente, entrei nisso nessa fase. Ainda estou tentando entender. Fico muito impressionado com a desinformação que existe no Brasil sobre o assunto. Nesta manhã, alguém falou lá que a desinformação também dos nossos políticos. É muito impressionante a desinformação dos nossos políticos, dos nossos parlamentares. E eu até me lembro de uma história muito engraçada que eu tive, um amigo meu, que era parlamentar, deputado federal, e eu estava entrando nessa consciência da coisa, resolvi conversar com ele. E lá ele era parlamentar para que interviesse de alguma maneira na política do governo, naquele assunto. E ele me ouviu uma hora falar de tudo que eu sabia a respeito, que eu tinha aprendido até então, menos do que eu sei já agora, muito menos, mas o que eu contei para ele, ele falou, olha, você tem toda a razão, Chico, é isso mesmo, precisamos dar um jeito nisso aí. Agora, só te peço um favor, não mexe com o submarino nuclear. Ou seja, na verdade, é uma desinformação tão trágica que a gente fica pensando. Então, o que acontece no Brasil é que o problema para nós, toda discussão econômica, tecnológica, todos os tipos de discussão que pode se fazer em torno do nuclear, no fundo, na frente disso tudo, para nós, da chamada sociedade civil, por isso eu não sou nem físico nem nada, eu sou um ativista social, como se diz, né? Participo desses movimentos, não entendo das coisas. O principal problema para nós é o problema do risco. O risco de uma desses que eu chamo de monstros adormecidos, de repente acordarem e fazer o estrago que eles fazem, como fizeram em Fukushima, como fizeram em Chernobyl. E eu ficava muito impressionado, sempre fiquei impressionado, nos debates em que eu participei, inclusive com gente da eletronuclear, o próprio presidente, o próprio famosos personagens dessa coisa, porque eu fui entrando em 1000 situações quando um determinado senador achou que o assunto tinha que ser levado para o Senado e promoveu audiências públicas e me chamou para participar dessas, e eu participei dessas audiências com essas pessoas que são os responsáveis pelo programa nuclear brasileiro, inclusive pelo próprio programa da bomba, eram os responsáveis. E o que eles mais diziam para a gente, para se defender, eles diziam, vocês, a sociedade civil, têm muito medo e vocês querem trazer um medo para a população. Eu dizia, meus caros, você falou exatamente o que a gente quer. O que a gente quer é que a pessoa saiba os riscos que estamos correndo com esses monstros adormecidos espalhados. Nem falemos, naquele tempo eu nem falava ainda a questão do lixo atômico, a questão digamos, dos rejeitos, que são um problema não resolvido, que estão sendo resolvidos em Angra de uma maneira extremamente irresponsável. Eles adotaram o sistema americano de depósito a seco, puseram esse depósito a seco na praia de Itaorna, onde estão as outras usinas, passível, portanto, basta uma elevaçãozinha do nível do mar para chegar nesses coisas, e puseram aquela quantidade enorme de rejeito que já saiu das usinas Angra 1 e 2, estão nesses lugares passíveis de transformar, de criarem outro problema. Então, no fundo, eu diria para vocês e para você, Carlos, quer dizer, eu não posso trazer muita informação muito técnica, nem muito científica e nem muito completa de que foi a história do nuclear no Brasil. Eu só posso lhe dizer que o sentimento daqueles que começam a entrar nisso e de repente tomam consciência, como foi meu caso, é de extrema preocupação, e nós não temos dúvida em chamar, apesar de todas as outras utilizações medicinais, etc., que pode ter a energia nuclear, a extrema insanidade que é criar uma chaleira atômica, que para esquentar a água, que é ela que vai produzir eletricidade, não é energia nuclear, é a água quente, a fumaça produzida pela água quente que vai produzir eletricidade. Quer dizer, a insanidade que é se meter numa coisa tão perigosa, tão cheia ainda de problemas para resolver, e sem se dar conta do mal que estão fazendo. Então, a minha perspectiva é uma perspectiva de militante do medo. Eu sou militante, vamos apavorar. Agora, é muito difícil apavorar, porque tudo é muito distante do cotidiano das pessoas. Muito distante. E o nível de desinformação que temos no Brasil é tamanho. Eu me lembro que eu me meti em 1000 coisas, de iniciativas, tipo tentar fazer projetos de lei com assinatura popular, contra novas usinas, etc. E era triste a gente ir buscar assinatura e passar um jovem na frente da gente e dizer, olha, vem aqui, estamos pensando nisso, você não quer assinar essa proposta de projeto de lei contra as usinas nucleares? Não, a usina nuclear é um modo mais barato, mais limpo e mais seguro de se produzir eletricidade. Quer dizer, quando a gente ouvia de um jovem estudante, inclusive de física, estudante da universidade, e essa frase mostra bem a que nível estamos da conscientização da população, dos técnicos que estão entregando o seu suor, o seu tempo, sua vida para que isso aconteça, e mais ainda dos políticos que vão decidir o que fazer com isso tudo. Estamos longíssimos de fazer, e por isso essa perspectiva que nós abrimos agora com o Raul, com os argentinos, de trabalhar internacionalmente mais essa questão. E nós temos, vou dizer para vocês que vocês conhecem seguramente o Fórum Social Mundial. Né? O Fórum Social Mundial, uma iniciativa brasileira, da qual eu participei, e que em 2013, pela primeira vez, já existia desde 2001, 2013 levou a questão nuclear para ser discutida num fórum. Isso foi na Tunísia. E o segundo fórum que houve na Tunísia, em 2015, havia muitos japoneses, que vinham, inclusive, por causa de Fukushima. E nós, então, lá, os que estavam lá, franceses, brasileiros, canadenses, japoneses, decidimos fazer um fórum social temático antinuclear. E decidimos que o primeiro seria no Japão. Foi feito um primeiro no Japão, um ano depois foi feito um no Canadá, no ano seguinte foi feito um na França, onde o movimento antinuclear é muito mais forte, né? Mas que, inclusive, por decisões de governo, se vê diante do fato consumado do fato de quererem ainda impingir mais usinas para aquele país, franceses e turcos e outros vieram, fizemos um fórum, o último fórum que fizemos depois da França foi em Madrid, na Espanha. E agora estamos pensando em organizar um fórum em 2024, social, temático, antinuclear, para ver se articulamos e aprendemos uns com os outros, mas principalmente definimos estratégias internacionais, mundiais, para enfrentar um problema que até agora foi tratado dentro dos nossos países somente, para ver se começa a ganhar dimensão uma ação antinuclear realmente internacional. E vamos fazer, se tudo der certo, vamos conseguir fazer esse fórum na Argentina em 2024. E já estão convidados para participar, vocês aqui que estão nos ouvindo. Eu tomo essa liberdade, apesar de ser, não sei quem organiza, mas como estamos organizando conjuntamente, estamos começando a organizar argentinos e brasileiros, inclusive a experiência que tivemos de junção diante da atitude dos nossos presidentes, de se acertarem em coisas que não deveriam ser feitas sem consulta à população, né? Esperemos que eles ainda não concretizem isso, que realmente a consulta seja feita. Para isso, escrevemos uma carta aberta, estamos tentando, mas então, apesar de nós estamos tentando organizar esse fórum, e seria muito bom que vocês pudessem participar, que o México trouxesse a riqueza da reflexão e da ação que já tive por lá em torno disso, para a gente ver se consegue definir uma estratégia internacional de superação dessa verdadeira ameaça que a humanidade criou para si mesma.
Muito obrigado, Chico. Thank you very much. We are aware that we can mix the languages, even if I think we have an international audience, but of course we have 15 minutes left for the debate. I would like to know if there are any questions, mainly for Arturo. I know that you have your classes in few minutes, I think, or not. So I know that you are in a rush right now. So I don't know, I would like to collect some questions. Please, Luke, could you come here? Because I think we need to use this microphone.
Hi, thanks very much for pardon me, for three fascinating papers. My Portuguese isn't good enough to have followed the third, but I very much enjoyed the first two, and I look forward to watching the recording and translation of the third afterwards. So, Arturo, first of all, for you, you'd mentioned in 1959 that Mexico had flirted with the idea of having a nuclear weapons program. And then, of course, in the 1960s, it fully embraced kind of nuclear disarmament and led the way in that way. I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit on kind of how far this nuclear weapons program got, and perhaps why it was terminated. And then for Raul, I have perhaps a very specific question. I'm finishing up a book on Canada and nuclear issues. And so you mentioned the Embalse nuclear reactor and also the covert nuclear weapons program under the military regime in Argentina. I was just wondering if you know whether any of the Canadian supply technology was used by the regime in its nuclear weapons program or not. Thanks.
We have another question for Arturo. I don't know, but Ricardo, please.
I would like to ask you about if you think that Latin America can be a leader in nuclear non-proliferation, because a lot of constitutions around Latin America, they already say that they forbid nuclear waste and nuclear weapons, and I would like to ask your thoughts about it, and your thoughts about nuclear cooperation in Latin America. I think it was Raul who said that this seminar is a very nice initiative in this sense, and how can we keep doing that?
Okay, thank you. Any other question? Okay. Okay, Heather. Heather is PhD candidate from the University of Johannesburg, and she has a question. She is connected from South Africa. Please, Heather, go ahead.
It is not much of a question. So I am the baby in the group. I'm focusing on nuclear hedging and nuclear latency, and Brazil is my case study. There's a lot that I've learned today because, I'm not that familiar with Brazil, and I'm learning as I go, and I've learned so much more from being in this workshop than I would have learned when I was reading all the papers, and I'm reading that. And my question or the piece of advice that I'd like to ask from you guys is, Raul mentioned that, apologies if I'm, pronouncing your name incorrectly. You mentioned the word dangerous. You mentioned how there is no capacity to actually, there's no medical capacity for any nuclear emergencies or nuclear, if there's an accident, there's no medical capacity to that. So when I joined the first, or maybe the second or third part of this workshop, I had a discussion with one of a practitioner. He said to me that I should not use the word dangerous, and why am I seeking what I'm seeking? Why am I asking the questions that I'm asking? So I wanted to know from anyone that would like to answer this question for me, how do I, as someone who is researching and is very curious and is learning so much about Brazil, because it's a very, very new topic to me, how do I respond to such questions? Because I recently discovered that from the district or province that I was born in, they actually disposing nuclear waste that side, and we also struggling with nuclear waste, nuclear waste accidents. And for someone to say to you, when you are concerned about something that is happening in your hometown that could affect you, how do you respond to them as a junior that I am? And without the experience that you have, how do you tell them that it is still dangerous? Because dangerous is not a word that I'm allowed to use, and that it is a big deal. That is my question. And I just want to say thank you to everyone. This has been an amazing workshop. I agree with Raul. It is historical. I agree with Arturo. It is like Carlos' book is literally my Bible, without better terms or putting it in the way to put it, because Brazil is very new to me. So I just feel like I'd like to just know how to approach a situation like this, because I couldn't answer the way I'd answer them without having the knowledge that I got from this entire workshop today.
Heather, I would like to pass the floor to give the floor to Arturo for the first answers, for your first reply, and then then letting you free.
Sure. Actually, if you don't mind, I like to take a portion of Heather's question and then take on the other question about what happens after 1958, if that's okay with you. Because the name of my project is Peaceful but Dangerous. And it's a way of describing that although Mexico did develop a civilian and mostly peaceful nuclear project, it is inherently dangerous, following Raul's and Chico's insights. Raul actually mentioned that Argentina is the site of one of the largest nuclear accidents in the hemisphere, but Mexico is the site of the largest nuclear spill radioactive theft in the history of the Americas. It happened in Chihuahua, in Ciudad Juarez in 1984, and is known as the Chernobyl of the Americas. Radioactive material was stolen. Not only was it stolen, it was then trafficked, used, processed. 200 people died in Ciudad Juarez. And in Mexico, in the recent years, we have had at least 7 of these incidents where radioactive materials has disappeared or vanished in the hands of organized crime. Radioactive material is being used for illicit trafficking. There is an illicit market of radioactive material. And so on the one hand, there is that danger. And on the other hand, there's the other danger that I think it appears to be common in the rest of Latin America. Very interestingly enough, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina start this project for almost similar reasons. There's a desire to become an autonomous energy country. And it's the idea of having, an enormous resource that can provide energy and diversify our sources of energy. But throughout its political development, of course, they have different ends and whatnot. But what is interesting is that in the case of the 3 countries, what we have seen in the last years is, in fact, less energy production with our nuclear plants. In the case of Mexico, the amount of energy that is being taken from Laguna Verde is today 3.5. It used to be 5.5 of Mexico's energy came from the nuclear plant. So the plant itself has become ineffective, inefficient, and also more dangerous. In 2017, we had an earthquake in Mexico, and the plant in Mexico is very similar to Fukushima. It's one of these General Electric plants that relies on water from a lagoon, Laguna Verde, and the plant had to be shut down twice during the earthquake. So you can already see some of the dangers implicit there. And the problem is Mexico is not the lack of scientific knowledge. As I was able to describe, there is sufficient scientific knowledge. We've been doing nuclear science for decades now. It's not the lack of know-how. There is know-how, right? It's in fact the fact that maintenance is not always done, that safeguards are not put up to the level where they should be, and that the state hasn't taken actions to improve nuclear security. So it's a danger from a nuclear security perspective. At least when it comes to Mexico. So to take now, let me just take that to the first question. Well, what happens in 1958? Because Mexico could have been like Brazil and Argentina, where indeed they did explore the military applications of nuclear energy. Now, in the case of Mexico, I would say that one thing that saved Mexico is that it's a latecomer compared to Argentina and Brazil. Argentina is a pioneer by all means, but it is a latecomer, and by the time they come and they arrive there, two things happened. One is, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, and I'm writing about that. That is a transformative experience for Mexico that shifts, is really the critical juncture that transforms the project. The very same president that authorizes the opening of the Nuclear Research Institute in Mexico, Adolfo López Mateos, is the same president that has to confront the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 while he's traveling overseas. So I have a chapter that has all the pictures of 13 days in Mexico, and it's a power of images. But the most interesting and intriguing factor in Mexico was the fact that while López Mateos, he's in the Philippines, he's in Asia while the crisis takes place, he's one of the few presidents that talked to Fidel Castro. He's assured by Fidel Castro that there are no nuclear weapons in Cuba. And then President Kennedy sent an envoy to the Philippines to tell him, you need to return to your home country because you are one of the targets of those Soviet missiles. And they show him a map, and they say, we suspect there are 11 missiles targeting Mexico. Kennedy doesn't stop there. He sends a plane to fly López Mateos back to Mexico from the Philippines. He stops in Hawaii for refueling and then goes to Mexico City. But that doesn't end the crisis. López Mateos is the second civilian president of Mexico and the youngest president at the time. And when he arrives in Mexico, he finds that the entire army had been sent to its back to the it's called resguardo in the military units, which for any other country that would have meant essentially a military coup. And that was an order that he didn't take. It was the Minister of the Interior, Díaz Ordaz, who does that. And so I think López Mateos was extremely afraid of the repercussions. Now, and therefore decides that we need to shift. We need to shift the policy immediately because otherwise you're going to invite the military to come in. But I want to end with this footnote. The military is not completely eliminated from nuclear policy in Mexico. Because of 1962, the institution that provides for nuclear safeguards, the security of the nuclear installations in Mexico, the security of the nuclear plant, is delegated to the army itself. So even in that small sphere, the military and the army is still in charge of providing security for nuclear installations, and they're doing an awful job as well. And that element hasn't disappeared today, even if Mexico is completely devoted to the civilian development of nuclear energy. So I hope I didn't take too much time, but those are my answers.
Thank you very much, Arturo. And thank you very much for participating this evening. And I would like to I hope to see more about your evidence and that fantastic paper, that fantastic presentation you had today. I think I can pass the word to Raul. I think that Heather was asking about the feeling of danger we feel still here in both in Brazil and Argentina after in the cities of our accident. And Ricardo, you were what's your feeling about the possible cooperation in Latin America, also in this feeling of nuclear disarmament, not nuclear disarmament, of the nuclear campaign against nuclear energy? And in this case, I would like to add, do you guys participate also in the campaign against nuclear weapons, or just against the civilian use? I don't know if you do this distinction, because Chico mentioned something that highly sensitive. That is the issue of the nuclear submarine. You can touch everything but not the nuclear submarine. And we know that now the nuclear submarine is the main infrastructural project here in Brazil. The biggest project, the biggest public project, new universities. But having a nuclear submarine that we don't know when it will be actually ready, or is it will possible to be ready. And these are the two questions. What are the kind of cooperation? What are also what's possible cooperation, since you are setting up a network, also a global network, but also Latin American network, and also if your fight is against all the fronts or just the civilian fronts. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I have been reading. I will start with the question of Heather. Because it is important to mention that South Africa, we have been working with the anti-nuclear movement of South Africa, but South Africa is the first country that during the apartheid developed a nuclear weapon, and this is the first country that dismantled his nuclear weapon, and they face the problem of the bubble reactors. South Africa have a strong problem with the bubble reactors. I think it's important to mention that there is no solution for nuclear waste, because any exhausted nuclear fuel is dangerous for at least 2,400 centuries. This is a result of multiplying the half-life of plutonium-239 per 10. Thus, there is no solution for this, because there is no administrative system for maintaining control during a period of time so long. It's absolutely impossible. Thus, we have no solution for nuclear waste, and repositories are not the solution. It's only a political decision that cover immediate periods of time, but cannot cover all the period of time needed for having security. Concerning the containers of nuclear waste, they need to prevent what will happen during 10,000 years, but it's impossible to think that we have solution for periods of this kind, 10,000 years or 2,000 centuries. This is important thing. The other one is that concerning radioactivity. From Bayer 7th phase 2, this is a product of the Academy of Sciences of the States. It is absolutely clear that there is no safe limit for radioactivity. We have limits for example, arsenic. We know that we have 0.1 milligram per liter. We are in a limit that is near the safe limit. But with radioactivity, there is no limit. More exposure is more risk, but there's no level of risk. And this is why ICRP, the International Commission for Radiation Protection of Radiation, they created a particular concept, is the value that we can face, taking account benefits and risks. But these limits, these acceptable limits, are no limits for protecting health and the environment. They are limits for protecting the industry and the nuclear lobby, but not people and not the biodiversity. This is, I think, a very important concept. And concerning the dangers, I think that this is one of the big challenges, because the nuclear lobby tried to explain to people that nuclear energy, if well managed, don't involve risk. And this is absolutely not true. Thus, the big challenge is to explain to people this concept of the no threshold, there is no safe limits, but at the same time, it's important to explain that any kind of nuclear reactor, small, medium, or big, they have the same kind of risk because they have the same kind of radioactive material inside the core of the reactor. And Fukushima Daiichi showed to us, I understand totally why in Brazil it was so strong, the impact of Fukushima, because the image of Japan was, we are the technological country. As a technological country with 58 nuclear reactors, we can control everything. And this was a lie, because they had a tsunami, they have even the nuclear waste very accessible for this kind of event. Thus, it was a lie. TEPCO, which is the company that managed the Fukushima Daiichi plant, showed to us that they don't have plan A, B, or C. The only plan for this is try to control the minds of affected people and not to make more noise. But I think that concerning nuclear issues, first of all, there is no limit of safety, but at the same time, our big challenge as country, as organization, is to show to the population, first, that nuclear energy don't provide big amounts of electricity, like in Mexico. In Argentina, it's no more than 6% of the total energy. In France, now they have 32 nuclear reactors out of service, and they have strong problems for controlling some risk of their nuclear power plants. Thus, this is a technology that we cannot address as safe. Is dangerous, with very big costs, and most important than everything, without social control. This is one of the human technologies with less social control, and this is very important. We can control a plant producing electricity with fuel, but we don't have control for plants producing electricity by nuclear fuel. And this is a very strong concept, is the technology with the less social control. And even in the most advanced countries, the secrecy is the key for maintaining nuclear energy. And this is another very important concept, secrecy. No social control, secrecy, and this very important concept mentioned by Chico is the weapons connection, but also is some nationalist connection. if you have nuclear energy, you are a powerful country. And being realistic, technically realistic, one of the more stupid decisions that can make a government is to implement nuclear power, particularly in a region. In a region like Argentina, to have nuclear power, it was a more stupid decision because you have a lot of alternative sources. Why this kind of energy? And Chico also, I think he provided a very interesting explanation for being taken into account in other countries too, is that usually this feeling that they will have power has behind this perception lot of companies that are interested in the business of the building and of the maintenance of nuclear power. Nuclear power is a big business, but solely a big business for corporations, not for populations, not for communities. For that and for this, secrecy, lack of environmental impact assessment, and lack of social control are keys. That's for this, I think it's important, this even all the concept developed here, because people need to have in their daily life all these kind of answers and elements for taking decisions, because in our region, all decisions have been taken by military governments, members of parliament that don't understand what means nuclear energy, and businessmen, the big world of corrupted corporations. And this is the truth for nuclear energy. Nuclear energy has behind one of the strong and more dangerous network of corrupted corporations.
Thank you very much, Raul. I don't know if there is any question for Chico. Não sei se tem alguma questão para o Chico Whitaker. Essa é a última pergunta, porque já estamos um pouco fora do tempo, mas temos perguntas aqui. Eu ficaria a noite inteira, porque é fascinante ter essa oportunidade. Pode vir, Victor, aqui para formular a pergunta. Temos somente o microfone.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu gostaria de perguntar ao Chico se o movimento ele é suprapartidário, se ele está convencendo pessoas de todos os espectros políticos ou se está só naquela bolha, né? Isso é importante, né, porque se é um movimento nacional, se nós temos que lutar contra isso, nós temos que convencer muitas pessoas e a democracia, né, é assim que funciona. Então, eu gostaria de perguntar como esse movimento está se portando.
Ok, a palavra é com você, Chico.
Olha, esse movimento tem que ser suprapartidário. E porque ele tem que, inclusive, convencer determinados partidos, até de esquerda, que estão totalmente equivocados em relação a isso. Há partidos de direita que já usam isso porque o problema deles é poder. Agora, infelizmente, há partidos de esquerda que estão equivocados. Ainda estão trabalhando com princípios e coisas do tempo da Guerra Fria. Ou seja, já passou tudo isso. E eles estão equivocados sobre a maneira de conduzir a geopolítica. Existe esse problema do poder do país. Mas o poder do país não pode ser o poder da força. O poder do país é o poder do convencimento de que precisamos todos viver normalmente, senão o mundo vai explodir. Inclusive, para muita gente não preocupa a questão da bomba, porque é mais ou menos óbvio, do bom senso, que só vai acontecer um apocalipse nuclear se muitos dirigentes virarem loucos. Mas basta um ficar louco para os outros segurarem todos, porque todos têm consciência, todo mundo tem o mínimo de consciência que não pode entrar no enfrentamento nuclear. Se entrar, acaba o mundo. A palavra apocalipse nuclear já foi usada por muita gente. Mas tem gente ainda dentro de partidos que acham que temos que ter força, temos que nos impor aos outros países, e o nuclear é a maior das armas, a arma das armas, que seguramente determina a possibilidade da dominação. Então eu digo para você, o grande problema nosso é saber uma maneira de a gente furar as bolhas. Eu estou num outro projeto em que a gente está trabalhando essa questão. Como a gente pode passar informação, que não é tentar convencer ninguém, é passar informação, porque as pessoas não sabem. Uma das coisas que mais me impressionou no meu aprendizado sobre o nuclear foi descobrir que ele é uma chaleira. A usina nuclear é uma chaleira. A gente fala energia elétrica produzida pelo nuclear. Não, é produzido pelo mesmo vapor que sai de uma usina a diesel. A usina a diesel produz vapor que toca uma turbina. Eu, quando descobri isso, eu falei, meu Deus do céu, mas como é que nos enganam dessa maneira? É como se o solar, por exemplo, tem um efeito direto do raio solar sobre o silício, que determina não sei tipo de coisa, é completamente diferente. No nuclear, não tem relação nenhuma o nuclear com a eletricidade. O nuclear aí é usado para esquentar água. Quando me disseram isso, que isso é a primeira pessoa que me falou isso, foi exatamente o Bernard Laponche, lá da França. Eu li no artigo dele, não sei em que revista, não sei em que jornal, falei, ué, que é isso aí? O que esse cara está dizendo? Aí fui tentar aprofundar. E quando eu encontrei o Sidney aqui da CNEM, ele falou, não, mas é isso mesmo. Toda aquela parafernália, tudo aquilo, é porque estão esquentando água com coisa muito perigosa, que é a fissão do átomo, que é o mesmo tipo de perigo da bomba atômica. Qual é a diferença entre o urânio enriquecido para a bomba e o urânio enriquecido para a usina? Na usina basta enriquecer a 3 a 4% de U-235, que é o que cinde, que é o que pode ser cindido. Na bomba precisa 80% a 90% de enriquecido. A diferença é só essa. Ou seja, na verdade, a usina é, se a gente for pensar bem, é uma brincadeira digamos, de ingênuos. Ou, claro que não é brincadeira, obviamente, o que está por trás disso é exatamente controlar o enriquecimento do urânio, etc., para a bomba. Né? Mas a usina é uma chaleira. Eu, inclusive, nas nossas conversas aqui no Brasil, eu estou, digamos, soltando bastante essa. Eu vi a Monique, que falou de manhã, ela falou chaleira atômica. Ótimo, quer dizer que está pegando. Quer dizer, é uma chaleira como qualquer outra. Como é que esquenta a água? Diesel, carvão, fogo, como é que esquenta? E fissão nuclear. Agora, o mais impressionante disso tudo em relação ao perigo é que o risco de uma usina fundir pelo calor descontrolado dela, lá dentro dela, porque ela produz calor, mas se deixar esse calor subir por conta própria, ela vai fundir. E os desastres de Fukushima e de Chernobyl foram porque aconteceu isso. Ela derreteu. E o derretimento, uma série de outras consequências, criação de hidrogênio, explosão, etc., etc. Então, na verdade, é brincar com fogo. Quer dizer, nós vamos... E naquele tempo, na usina de Firmarizada, dizia que era impossível acontecer de um reator fundir. Impossível. Isso não pode. Aí aconteceu. Aconteceu uma vez, aconteceu uma segunda vez, aconteceu uma terceira vez. Quando aconteceu Fukushima, os deputados franceses pediram que o chefe do Serviço de Segurança Nuclear viesse até eles para dar explicações. E a pergunta era a seguinte: pode acontecer um acidente como o de Fukushima em alguma das nossas 56 usinas? a resposta do cara presidente da Organização de Segurança. Ele falou, pode, só não sabemos quando nem como, mas pode. Ou seja, é isso que nós criamos. Cada usina que a gente cria, além de ser uma grande produtora de lixo, que a gente não sabe onde colocar, além disso, é uma bombinha que a gente instala no quintal de casa. Até que um dia ela, por um erro mecânico, por um erro humano e por um impacto qualquer natural, ela esquente demais e exploda e passe, espalhe radioatividade por todo o território. O mundo já se livrou da radioatividade há muito tempo e nós resolvemos botar a radioatividade de novo, né? Espalhar por aí.
Muitíssimo obrigado, Chico.
Só queria dizer uma coisinha, pode dizer, cara, porque de manhã me impressionou uma pergunta de uma pessoa lá.
Sim.
Criticando a Alemanha por ter fechado as usinas, dizendo que era hipócrita. E eu acho, dá que ver, a Alemanha se livrou. Agora, é um erro dela deixar que a Checoslováquia continue no erro. Então, os militantes antinucleares alemães precisariam fazer um programa para convencer os países vizinhos todos de não ter usina, porque senão não adianta nada. O acidente nuclear não conhece fronteiras, ele passa por cima de tudo.
Infelizmente assim. Infelizmente assim, sei bem disso como italiano, visto que estamos rodeados de usinas e que a mesma Itália mesmo se abandonou a construir em outros lugares. Então, entendo bem esse perigo. Entendo um pouco a hipocrisia, porque, de fato, em países abandonaram, mas construíram em outros lugares. Então, talvez esse foi o significado, né? Mas acho que fechamos com a chave de ouro. I think we ended our discussion today. It was a very richful session dealing with the three cases of the three countries. I hope this one is the first of several meetings also for understanding the convergence about civil society associations in the field of anti-nuclear case against nuclear energy, against nuclear weapons. And tomorrow we will have another rich sessions that will be a session, there will be two sessions, let's say more institutional maybe, but when we'll discuss how Brazil and how the interconnection also with Argentina created initiatives for getting rid of the bombs, of the nuclear bombs at least in the areas. And above all, in the last panel, we will try to understand what was also the interconnection between international NGOs, like the ICANN International Campaign for Abolishing Nuclear Weapons, and institutional initiatives like that of Brazil that submitted the proposal to abolish nuclear weapons with the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But now, one of the main challenges, and I tell you, as one of the main challenges for this is the ratification. The Brazilian Congress should approve a treaty that Brazil proposed to the international community, signed, but didn't ratify. So tomorrow there will be also the discussion about how the civil society, how the scientific societies, and how other networks as yours, guys, can contribute to this kind of support to this kind of international treaties that are critical of the current nuclear order. So, thank you very much. Muito obrigado por terem ficado com a gente até agora e espero até a próxima em breve. Muito obrigado mais uma vez.